starting with the Chicago Bears. You said everything for the Chicago Bears. You don't give out everythings to everybody.
No. And, people get very upset about that, because nobody wants to see that their team just stinks across the board. They're like, it's not everything. You're like, yeah, okay.
We don't need a left tackle. We had Braxton Jones.
Right. Maybe you don't. Maybe you've decided you don't need the quarterback, and maybe you don't need a tight end because Cole Kmet's fine. But you do pretty much need everything, right? You need defensive line help. You need linebacker help. You need secondary help. You need offensive line help. You need receiver help. I think, isn't Montgomery a free agent as well? You need running back help. Like, you do need everything. Maybe you don't need every single player, but you do pretty much need every position.
Cole Kmet's also heading into the last year of his contract. I mean, it's not like – when we talk about this stuff, we try to think about it from a multi-year view as well, which is why we kept criticizing the Texans for just getting, signing 1- and 2-year contracts. Of course the Bears need everything. They need help across the board. I mean, if you want to get specific, yeah, they need to be better along the offensive line. Did they find a potential steal in Braxton Jones in the 5th round out of Southern Utah last year? Absolutely. That's awesome. Got to upgrade along the offensive line because you can't just – they were pretty well protected in a run-first system. Receiver, of course, if you're going to roll with Justin Fields, we said before the season, are we going to know what Justin Fields is? Here's what we learned. I think, as he's a dynamic runner. We still don't know enough about him as a passer. Has he been held back as a passer because of his own passing skills or because he hasn't had the supporting cast to throw to? I'll say this. We might not see an offseason quite like what the Bears have as far as having the number 1 overall pick, having all of the money that they can spend in free agency, the ability with that number 1 pick to flip it for multiple picks or future picks or whatever they want to do. The Bears, when Ryan Poles came in, your phrase, like strip it for parts, right? You trade Khalil Mack, you trade Robert Quinn along the way. They traded down in the draft a ton. That was the way to do it. They were left with no cap space and no draft capital, and they replenished both.
Yeah.
And now the rebuild starts this offseason. Everything is on the table for the Bears.
And it's why, it's not necessarily a negative. It's just the reality of the situation.
Of course.
Like, they did strip this roster down to nothing, which is why the whole narrative around Justin Fields was what it was. Like, does he have anything around him in order for him to even be evaluated this year? And then, okay, Justin Fields is showing some stuff, but he has no receivers to throw to. The offensive line has been a little bit better, but it still needs work. Like, they did strip it down. There's nothing there. Now, you think you've seen enough in Justin Fields to be the guy. Fine, go. But now you need to then deploy all of that capital, whether it's getting the trade haul for trading out of number 1, using that salary cap space, although, on what is debatable given the free agent market. But the point being, now you actually need to build the thing back up again because you did strip this entire roster down to bare bones, i.e. Justin Fields and a few randoms.
So the one move that right now doesn't look great is the Chase Claypool trade. It seemed like everything that Ryan Poles had done since joining the Bears was pretty much, all right, we're thinking of the future. And the one move, and it didn't seem ridiculous at the time because we didn't think that the Bears were going to pick number 1 overall. But now Chase Claypool for a 2nd rounder. That's the 32nd overall pick.
Yeah.
Basically a 1st rounder. And even when it happened, we were like, so that you can get a look at Chase Claypool, right? You get a look at him for a year, but he's only under contract for a year and a half. So now you've got 1 more year of Chase Claypool. That doesn't look great. But everything else, as far as the ability to maneuver in the draft, to add impact players, and going back to last offseason when people, and you may have been saying, hey, they're not doing enough for Justin Fields here because their first 2 picks were defensive players. The long game of bringing in Kyler Gordon, who was up and down as a rookie at corner, Jaquan Brisker at safety, who was their most valuable defensive player this year, by the way, as a rookie safety. Okay, that's the long-term play. You added a couple pieces to the secondary. Now they need impact players everywhere. Defensive line, more players in the secondary. Clearly they need receivers. Offensive line help. David Montgomery at running back as a free agent. They need help everywhere. And whether it's with Justin Fields or without, right? If they are having that discussion about do we draft Bryce Young and trade Fields, whether or not they're having that, the rest of the roster does need to be attacked with all of these resources.
Yeah, and I think, to me, Justin Fields has done enough to earn the shot to show what he has with something around him. Like, it's very difficult to overstate how bad the situation around him was this year, and he still showed quite a lot. More as a runner, obviously, than a passer, but still showed what a dynamic playmaker he could be. Now give him receivers. Now give him defense. Now give him an offensive line that can be good, not just hold its head above water. Like, give him the things that he should have to prove what he can be. And then if he isn't capable of being more than this, then fine. Okay, you took a misstep, but I think you owe it to him at this point to show you what he can do with a real supporting cast around him.
When we get into some more of the specifics of what the Bears could do with, if they trade down, pick up a bunch of draft picks, we're going to talk a lot about this receiver class this offseason. Maybe it doesn't have the Jamar Chases of the world. It doesn't have the Justin Jeffersons, the elite players. And the other thing we tend to say a lot is, which flavor of receiver you're looking for. Do you want a big 6'4" Quentin Johnson? Do you want a Zay Flowers who's fast and quick? A Jackson Smith and Jigba who might be more of a slot receiver, but is just such a good route runner. There are all different styled receivers. I do wonder with what we know about Fields as a runner now, much like the Ravens kind of leaned into speed receivers, thinking, hey, we're going to run the ball a lot, QB run game, big plays off of that. You have Darnell Mooney on one side. Are we looking for speed receivers? Are we looking for your big play threats? A guy like a Jordan Addison out of USC, formerly of Pittsburgh, that can stretch the field. Because, again, we're not probably looking to free agency a ton for receiver needy teams this year. But drafting maybe one or two of those receivers, different styles, but at least somebody that can stretch the field, much like Mooney can. I think Cole Kmet, I think any tight end works well in this system because with all the misdirection and play action you're going to have with Fields, those tight ends are going to be open regardless. I want some big play receivers for the Bears.
Yeah, I just want anything added to that team.
Well done. Great. So Bears need everything. I think you nailed it. Let's go Detroit Lions here. And they finished strong, 9-8. You went with cornerback for their biggest need here.
Yep. I still think that's a problem area for them. Jeffrey Okudah was better this year, still wasn't great. None of the young guys really that they've added to that cornerback room recently have panned out. The pass rush, I think, worked its way out. The defensive line generally, Lynn McNeil, started to show promise. Aiden Hutchinson through the second half of the season was looking like a fantastic player. James Houston came out of nowhere, was getting some real joy on the other side. I think that defensive line is going to be in good shape next year. They hit on a linebacker in the draft as well. Cornerback, though, is still a big problem spot.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And when we talked about the Lions and their rebuild, being so trench heavy, and then it did seem like last year, man, they improved that receiving core, right? Like last year was the year that they were going to start improving on the perimeter. And they, over the last 2 years with Amon-Ra St. Brown, drafting Jamison Williams last year, they brought in DJ Chark for the 1 year. He'll hit free agency, but the one spot that's still lacking is definitely corner. They have to make a fifth-year option decision on Jeffrey Okudah. Even with improvement last year, I don't know how you pick that up for a guy that was, third overall, right? Mm-hmm. Huge money for Okudah if you pick that up. So, yeah, it's a year where they have to bring in probably 2 or 3 cornerbacks, I would say, in Detroit. And a lot of those other pieces that you had talked about, the investment in the defensive line, some of the draft picks last year that they hit on, and, late wins at, edge rusher with James Houston the fourth and all that stuff. They've added a lot of good talent in Detroit. The next piece, though, definitely has to be secondary, but in particular, cornerback.
Yeah, I think they're another team that could use wide receivers as well, but you have to assume that Jamison Williams will take some kind of step forward next year. And he barely played this season. It was like a redshirt year for him.
Right.
But even when they got him on the field late and he was getting like 10, 15 snaps a game, he didn't get an awful lot of production, but you could see just from watching him move around that he brings that just difference-making kind of speed. And, all right, they didn't turn that into much year one, but I suspect they will year two.
Yeah, I don't think they should be neglecting receiver. I still think there's more work to do, but I think we're in this. The offensive line's pretty well locked up for a few years now, like multi-year deals for everybody, essentially. The defensive line's had a lot of that draft investment. It's another year on the perimeter. It's another year of playmakers at receiver, playmakers at corner. But corner in particular, I think does make the most sense for the Lions. Let's go to the Green Bay Packers. And you're going, we'll see if quarterback, right? By the time you listen to this, I don't think Rodgers is getting traded. Is he getting traded this week?
Well, even if they trade him away, it's because Jordan Love is there. So quarterback, it's not going to be a need for them because they're going to be rolling with one of those two guys on the roster.
Well, you're going tight end here as the biggest need, though, for the Packers.
Yeah. I think the receivers, the young guys, showed enough last season to at least be confident in going forward. Maybe, I mean, obviously you can add a receiver to that, never stop adding playmakers, but I think tight end like needs an unquestioned legit starter. They need a guy that can make an impact at that position. So like Robert Tonyan saw 63 targets but averaged 1.3 yards per route run last season. Like he moved the chains 20 times in the entire year. That there's no reason they can't have an impact player at that position and take some of the pressure off, that wide receiver group that may be young or maybe limited or only have sort of specific skill sets. Let's take this in a different direction. Like we don't have to go first round wide receiver. We could get first round tight end.
Ooh, Michael Mayer from Notre Dame, maybe. I mean, Tonyan was a guy that was so productive just 2 years ago, 2020, I believe, when he was before he had gotten hurt. But he wasn't the catalyst, of course. It's like who's Big Bob Tonyan? Well, he's the guy that's open because you gotta focus on Devontae Adams and everything, right? And you didn't have that. You didn't have those receivers for most of the season opening things up for the tight end. So you're looking at this more like, hey, bring the catalyst that is going to take pressure off the other way, off of Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs and some of the younger guys. You have Alan Lazard, who's basically a glorified tight end as well. Big-bodied receiver. He's going to hit free agency. But specifically at the tight end position, Mercedes Lewis as well. You're what, 20 for Mercedes? Now he's almost 17 or 18. He's basically just an offensive tackle at this point. You have Josiah DeGuara heading into his last year with the Packers. So there's a big hole there at that position, whether it's Aaron Rodgers or Jordan Love at quarterback. I mean, just pass catchers in general that are going to take some pressure off the QB makes sense here in Green Bay. Mm-hmm. All right, I lost my place. Who's next?
Minnesota.
NFC North. Minnesota Vikings, of course. Where'd you go with the Vikings here?
Defensive tackle, interior defensive line. Now, they might need an edge rusher as well, depending on what happens with the two that they have, because the Vikings are one of those teams that plays the salary cap a little bit like the Saints. The credit card comes due at some point. You got to make some sacrifices to pay it off. Both Zadarius Smith and Danielle Hunter are on some pretty big money. Those two combined for 150 plus pressures last season. I don't know if either or both of them will be on the roster once we get around to the sharp edge of it. But whatever happens, like they need an interior presence, which wasn't really there this year. Despite having those two guys, they didn't have this sort of interior wrecking machine, even though Dalvin Tomlinson had a pretty good year.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago they brought in Tomlinson. They kind of bulked up on the defensive interior, but this year, different system, and you're just not getting – they just haven't really gotten pressure from that position a ton. And that, it seemed like the secondary had their issues, and they certainly did. It just wasn't a good overall team defense for the Vikings. It was a whole bunch of individuals who performed okay in isolation, like Hunter and Zadarius Smith, but even when pressure was getting home, the coverage wasn't. It was one of those where just not all working in sync here. And when you look at the offense, a lot of that group is coming back right now, right? So you're talking about the defensive side is where most of the attention is going to go in Minnesota as it is. You mentioned the edge rushers. We'll see what happens there. Financially, both guys on contracts making over $14 million a year. But a penetrating interior defensive lineman, they're not the only team that's looking for those types of players, right? Those are the types of players that are available this offseason for the first time in a while around the NFL.
And nobody knows, by the way, what defense they're going to be running next year because they don't have a defense coordinator yet.
Yeah, that's true too. I mean, are they just 3-4 and 4-3 is outdated, but they were running 3-4 type of principles this year, right? How much of that is like, all right, let's go back to what we were. Mike Zimmer was as 4-3 as it gets, right? Like the types of players he was getting your classic hand in the dirt defensive ends, classic nose, your classic 3 technique, 3-4 defense kind of like blends those a little bit more. Are you going to go back to what Zimmer was doing, or does it just depend on whether the defensive coordinator search takes him?
Yeah, I mean, I think the defense top to bottom needs a lot of help. The defensive line, I think, probably needs the most, but the secondary needs a lot of help. But you assume that some of that is already there in young players that they drafted a year ago that didn't play for different reasons. Lewis Cine obviously broke his leg in that London horrific special teams play. Andrew Booth Jr. barely played either. So 2 guys that were supposed to sort of be the foundation of that secondary going forward, or at least the heirs apparent to the guys that have been there for a long time, really didn't feature at all. Now, does that mean they're not going to be factors going forward, or do we just have to wait a while before they make an impact? But like, they could provide reinforcements to the secondary. Eric Kendricks really didn't have a good year this year, but has been a good player in the past. Brian Asamoah, the linebacker, looked really good in limited snaps. Maybe he can come in, but either of those young guys need to step up, or they need impact additions at those positions.
We have four players in the top 40 who are interior defensive linemen on our draft board currently. And so so it's an interesting position this year in the draft. We haven't really had that group in a while. You mentioned Dalvin Tomlinson. He's a free agent this year, number 16 on our list overall for free agents, but two guys ahead of him, Daron Payne, Javon Hargrave. You have guys like Draymond Jones, Zach Allen. It's a solid group as far as like what availability in the market for that type of position around the NFL. It's better than it's been, I think, in a few years.